As the last ships of the Spanish Armada of 1588 crawled into their home ports, the English government sensed an opportunity that might only last a short time. Spain's fleets were temporarily badly weakened by the 1-2 punch of Drake's raid on Cadiz in the run-up to the Armada campaign, and then the losses incurred during that campaign itself. What was left of Spain's naval strength in Atlantic waters was currently battered and bruised, recuperating in several Spanish-held ports, with many of the crew sick, dying, or just gone home. Immediately after the Armada had gone off on its disastrous voyage around Scotland and Ireland, there had already been talk of sending the English fleet off to the Azores to capture the Spanish treasure fleet. But this had come to nothing, as the government's indifference to supplying the fleet once the immediate threat was over had led to an outbreak of disease, which some cynically hoped would reduce the overall amount they had to pay the sailors who'd just saved their country by killing off a good portion of them, because dead men can't claim wages. Thus weakened, the English fleet was in no state to sail off anywhere, and Lord Howard, Drake, and the others in charge said as much in fairly angry correspondence. But the government was keenly aware that as long as Spain remained able to exploit the gold and silver of South America, and possessed the various shipyards of the Spanish Empire, as well as at the time Portugal, which it had been taken over a little while previously, the Armada could be rebuilt, and then they'd all be back at square one. Having apparently learned nothing from Philip II's love of overly complex and unwieldy plans dooming seaborne expeditions, the English government therefore decided to put together their own hideously complex and unwieldy plan for a seaborne expedition. The following year, 1589, once the various ships involved had been refitted and new sailors had been found, a large fleet would be assembled, loaded up with troops, and sailed south to Spain. Here, they would first find and destroy the remnants of the Spanish Armada in whichever ports it happened to be found, which would further reduce Spain's naval strength and leave Philip II with an even larger bill and deficit of ships to make up. This would, however, only delay Spain's re-emergence. So, to further occupy the Spanish, they decided to take up the services of one Dom Antonio, the Prior of Crato and theoretical heir to the Portuguese crown. This all related back to how Philip II had ended up in charge of Portugal in the first place. With the death of King Sebastião of Portugal in battle, without any successor, the issue of who would take over the throne was a little bit of a problem. Tradition dictated that the closest male relative should be next in line. This was Sebastião's uncle Henry, but as a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, he couldn't marry or have children, at least legitimately, and he was pretty old. The choices of his successor were thus Dom Antonio, who was the son of another of Sebastião's uncles, the Duke of Beja. This seemed fairly straightforward, as the other four claimants were either women or the sons of Portuguese princesses, not princes. However, the fly in the ointment was that Dom Antonio was illegitimate, as his father had never married. This meant that the highly religious upper classes from Henry on down would rather see a woman, perhaps Duchess Catherine of Braganza, on the throne instead, or maybe Philip II, who had the advantage in their eyes of being a male, although his claim of descent was via his mother rather than his father. The fact that Philip was just across the border and had massive amounts of troops and lots of money clearly had nothing to do with this. The split in opinion came roughly down the lines of the nobles and the clergy wanting nothing to do with Dom Antonio, whilst the common people tended to have a bit more time for him. But when Henry finally decided that Philip II of Spain would rule Portugal and the Portuguese Empire after him, and Dom Antonio raised an army to support his own claim, he rapidly discovered that what was effectively a popular uprising of peasants stood fairly little chance against the well-oiled machine that was the Spanish army of the late 16th century, and he was defeated repeatedly and forced to flee. After various misadventures, he'd ended up in London, and with Spain becoming less and less popular, it was thought that an alliance of various kingdoms might be able to disrupt Spanish power by sparking an uprising in Portugal, which had become a little disillusioned by Philip II's effective invasion and subordination of the Portuguese Empire to his will, since ostensibly the two kingdoms were supposed to be still separate and only subject to a personal union of the crowns. But in reality, since as we've seen in the Spanish Armada series, Philip II was a control freak extraordinaire, being under his rule effectively meant you were part of the Philippine personal empire regardless of your nationality. Something the Portuguese galleon fleet could well attest to, as it counted which ships had made it back from the attempted invasion of England the previous year. Representations to Morocco, another nearby kingdom that was no fan of Spain, ended up going nowhere, and so the next stage of the plan, after destroying the Armada's shipping, was to land an army, and Dom Antonio, in Lisbon, taking the city and raising a revolt against the Spanish. If this was accomplished, then various enemies of Spain, even those who weren't signing up immediately, might be counted on to jump in on the first sign of Spanish weakness, a bit like a pack of hyenas who just saw a water buffalo stumble. The Dutch, who were already no fans of Spain thanks to the Duke of Parma trying to repress their ambitions to be an independent country, were also quite happy to sign up immediately to at least the general idea of the expedition, on the principle that anything that they could burn, destroy or steal in Spain was thus less likely to make its way back to their homeland in the form of an invasion force or reinforcements for the same. The final stage of the plan, once presumably Portugal was in full uproar, was to sail west and capture some or all of the Azores island chain, which the Spanish treasure fleets had to sail to and then past on their way to and from the Iberian Peninsula and Central America, where all the loot was collected. This would allow the English and presumably Dutch fleet, if all went well, to capture the treasure fleet itself as it came past, and thus either break even or perhaps even turn a profit on the entire enterprise, whilst also depriving Philip II of the same money which he needed to rebuild his fleet and pay for his troops, who would presumably be a little bit occupied. Dom Antonio promised that if he was given an army of 15,000 soldiers, he could get all of Portugal to his banner in just over a week from the time of landing. And he also said that he would repay the expedition with much gold from the Portuguese treasury, trade rights, military basing rights, and numerous other such enticements. The list does go on a fair bit. Everyone was agreed that the Spanish Armada remnants were the primary target, though, since if these were destroyed, even if everything else happened to fail that year, the seas would be clear and they could try again later. But there was now another problem. Just because it was 1589 instead of 1588 didn't mean that England had any significantly larger sums of money to hand. This wasn't some kind of RTS game where as the date turns over, a bunch of money magically appears in your coffers. And so instead, the commanders of the expedition, Francis Drake in charge of the naval side and Sir John Norris in charge of the land side and all the troops, turned the entire thing into a business venture by making a joint stock company. The Queen put some of her money in, as did the Dutch, but the bulk came from various private subscriptions, nobles, merchants, etc. And of course, a fair number of men and companies like Drake or the Merchants of London were also putting tangible assets on the line in the form of dispatching ships that they owned. With the expectation of achieving great profits, the between £80,000 and £100,000 needed to fund the expedition was raised, and many more men than were actually anticipated volunteered to take part, especially as troops. This ballooned the amount of supplies and the amount of shipping that was needed. But you can understand why they thought this was going to be lucrative. For reference, Drake's voyage around the world in the Golden Hind had netted him around about £800,000 worth of gold, silver, and gems. So the lure's understandable. If one small ship could bring home 8 times the money that was needed to outfit the over 200 vessels of the English Armada and all the supplies for the troops and sailors aboard, then surely hundreds of ships capturing the entire Spanish treasure fleet, not to mention looting large portions of the Spanish coast, would bring back even more. Even with the money issue sorted for the moment, further problems would now arise. The Dutch shied from sending a large number of actual warships, although several dozen Dutch merchantmen did show up for a laugh. Additionally, 60 Dutch flutes were seen in the Channel heading west to trade with France. Drake went out to see what was going on, and he found that some of them were bearing letters of safe passage written and issued by the Duke of Parma, who was still trying to suppress the Dutch, and so he assumed that the entire fleet was in league with the Spanish and seized them all. This at least solved the troop transport issues, since, in Drake's own words, a better fleet for transporting men could not be found in all of Europe. And to be fair, most of the Dutch crews don't seem to have overly cared that much about being precipitously taken out of Spanish service, if indeed that's what they'd been doing previously in the first place. With these ships added to the fleet, the total number of hulls comfortably exceeded 200, although only around 100 of these seem to have been listed as fully capable of combat, the rest being the aforementioned flutes, baggage ships, horse transports, supply ships, and the like. Many of the combat-rated ships had served in combat against the Armada the previous year, and included ships such as the Revenge, Tiger, Centurion, Nonpareil, Golden Noble, Dreadnought, Edward Bonaventure, Salmon, Swiftsure, Toby, Gift, Foresight, Merchant Royal, Seraphim, Aid, Fortune, Lion, and Young Foray, just to name the ships that were rated as over 200 tons. Notable, however, by their absence were a number of further large royal ships, such as the Ark Royal, Triumph, Elizabeth Jonas, Vanguard, and White Bear, which the Queen retained at home for various reasons. Numerically, therefore, the English Armada, as some have dubbed the expedition, also known as the Counter Armada, the Drake-Norris Expedition, and various other titles, outnumbered the Spanish fleet that had come up the Channel the previous year, although the Spanish Armada would still have outmassed this expedition considerably, as the handful of 400 to 500-ton race-built galleons, which were the largest ships in the fleet, compared somewhat poorly when you considered that over 60 of the Spanish ships the previous year were bigger than that, and some were well over twice that displacement. Combat capability was another matter, as we saw in the Spanish Armada series, but compared to the English fleet sent to counter the 1588 attack, there were considerably fewer full-sized combat ships in this expedition. The fleet was split into 5 squadrons for easier handling. Drake led one of them aboard the Revenge, Norris was aboard the Nonpareil to lead the second, Thomas Fenner was aboard Dreadnought at the head of the third, Roger Williams was supposed to lead the fourth in the Swiftsure, and Edward Norris was leading the 5th Squadron in the Foresight. The reason that Swiftsure wasn't immediately in charge of her squadron when the fleet sailed was that the Earl of Essex, the Queen's favourite, had sneaked aboard the ship after the Queen had ordered him explicitly not to go on the expedition. When the Queen sent officials to Plymouth to find him, the Swiftsure set sail immediately upon hearing they were in the town, and ended up hiding in Falmouth, from where it had to catch up with everyone else and try and find out where they'd gone. So the meet-up between Swiftsure and the rest of the fleet wouldn't be for some time. But even as the expedition sailed south, divisions were already showing up. Since this was a privately financed expedition, and many of those who'd backed it were also sailing with it to try and gain as much reward and loot as possible, these parties, of course, wanted to undertake the courses of action that were most likely to lead to them getting as much money as quickly as humanly possible. And to them, that meant landing in Lisbon, getting Dom Antonio to pay up, and then heading over to the Azores and stealing the Spanish treasure fleet. Drake and the other commanders, meanwhile, whilst hardly averse to a good bit of pillaging themselves, had orders from the Queen, and their own good sense, which said they had to take out the Spanish ships first. If nothing else, because otherwise those vessels, which had at least had the winter and part of spring to repair since the English fleet was sailing in April and due to arrive on the Spanish coast in May, could, if unmolested, sail out behind the English fleet if they set sail directly for Portugal, and cut off English lines of supply and retreat, at worst potentially pinning the English fleet between whatever shore batteries the Spanish had in Lisbon and a Spanish fleet out at sea. The Spanish themselves, painfully aware of their vulnerabilities, had been preparing for just such an attack and had spent much time trying to erect or reinforce existing fortifications. Having come to the conclusion that many of the ships would take considerably longer to repair and recrew than they had time for. And in any case, the Cadiz raid had shown that Drake could appear by surprise and catch even fully repaired and ready ships at anchor in any eventuality. That said, the resources they had available at the various Spanish ports were limited, and the defences which were established were unlikely to trouble any especially determined force. The bulk of the surviving Spanish Armada vessels were in the port of Santander, but Drake headed instead for the port of Corunna, where a few Armada ships were located, but nowhere near as many. Exactly why he did this is still a matter of debate. Some have suggested that with the expedition's financiers so determined to get to Portugal first, regardless of national interest, Corunna, which was on the northwestern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, could be sold to them as, well, a target that was pretty much on the way anyway. Whereas Santander, about 2/3 of the way along the northern Iberian coast heading towards France, was very definitely going the wrong way, if all you cared about was gold. Other suggestions are that he wanted an easy target to loot, or that Drake wanted a secure, if temporary, base to resupply and organise his ships before hitting Santander, where one could reasonably expect a little bit more opposition, and which might take some time to crack the defences of. Drake seems to have convinced the backers of the expedition to head for Corunna by saying that the winds were inconvenient and really all a bit wrong for heading straight for Lisbon, although the ship's records show that this was a case of blatant lies. Fortunately, most of the backers had no idea what seamanship was, so Drake was able to pull the wool over their eyes relatively easily. So perhaps it's a balance of all these factors, or at least some of them. In any case, the English fleet, which showed up on the 4th of May, was already somewhat diminished, a number of ships and a few thousand men having taken the chance afforded by the crossing of the Bay of Biscay to quietly drop out. Still, with only 2 large ships, the former flagship of Admiral Recalde, the San Juan, and the massive Regazona, which you will remember from several incidents during the Spanish Armada's voyage, being present in the harbour alongside a couple of galleys and a handful of smaller galleons, Corunna could do relatively little but await the tide of English troops who quickly came ashore. It now transpired that Sir John Norris had forgotten to bring any siege artillery, and so although the larger lower town was rather rapidly taken, the upper town, which was fortified with medieval-era walls, remained inviolate thanks to the lack of anything bigger than an arquebus to shoot at it, even though medieval curtain walls had proven rather vulnerable to large-scale cannon fire for a couple of hundred years by this point. After a bit of resistance from the ships in the harbour, they started to fall one by one, most of them at English hands, and the great San Juan at the hands of her own crew after it started coming under fire from ashore, as some English sailors had temporised by dismounting artillery from a few of their ships to set up some shore batteries of their own. The upper town and the associated castle, whose guns had been reinforced by some which had been taken preemptively from the Spanish ships which were now burning, maintained a clear zone around them through which the English ships could not pass without challenge. Nonetheless, the fall of the lower town allowed it to be plundered to resupply the fleet, and the siege of the upper town quickly developed. Spanish reinforcements would arrive to relieve the siege eventually, but in a relatively rare event, the Spanish troops lost a pike block engagement to the English troops and were forced to retreat with considerable losses. But at the same time, a number of English attacks on the upper town, even with the support of some of the smaller naval guns, which, as we mentioned, had been dismounted and brought ashore, were repulsed with severe losses of their own. As the population of the town combined with the remaining Spanish troops, who realised that they were completely trapped, and so they fought, in the words of one English soldier, like so many cornered rats. This went on for about 2 weeks, although it's difficult to piece together the precise details of the siege, as English records are fragmentary at best, and Spanish records whilst voluminous, tell the story from many different people's perspectives, and thus mutually contradictory accounts are given, some of which are clearly complete and utter fantasy, since if you added up the supposed losses inflicted on the English troops by some of the more inventive accounts day by day, more than half the English army apparently died in the streets of Corunna. But at the end of the fortnight, the English appear to have just given up the siege as a bad job and left, with around 1,500 verifiable losses incurred over the entire operation thus far. Having wasted so much time and still failed to secure Corunna, the English fleet now appeared to have forgotten completely about the Queen's orders to attack Santander and its cache of shipping, despite the fact that a rapid attack and overwhelming destruction of ships in harbour was about the only thing that had gone right for the English at Corunna. Instead, the fleet was now headed for Lisbon, which had of course now been granted a couple of weeks to prepare its defences on top of what it could otherwise have expected. The wind, however, chose to oppose the English, and although the fleet sailed on the 18th of May, it took them another week to arrive off the Portuguese coast just north of Lisbon, an average rate of advance of about 1.9 knots or 2.2 miles per hour. In other words, it would have been faster for the army just to walk from Corunna. Meanwhile, over in Lisbon, what defences could be made ready had been reinforced, but there was genuine concern that the city might easily be taken. With the tides racing through the estuary entrance to Lisbon Harbour, the defenders, looking at Drake's previous patterns of assault at various places, mostly in the Caribbean, calculated that if the English fleet sailed at speed, with a rising tide, they could pass the shore batteries quite easily and arrive dockside in Lisbon in remarkably little time, landing their still considerable numbers over a front wide enough that the defenders had neither the manpower nor the communications network to be able to even come close to stopping them. It was therefore proposed to block the entrance of the harbour with a great barrier made up of iron chains and wooden logs, with 20 ships anchored bow to stern in a line behind it, with all of their guns moved to face seaward. This would present an obstacle formidable enough to halt the English fleet long enough for the tide to turn and sweep them back out to sea. But good as the idea was, there simply weren't the resources for it. The defenders thus feared that if Drake kept to his character, whatever preparations they made would be for nothing anyway. Indeed, Drake, who apart from naval warfare mixed in with a good bit of piracy was also a specialist in taking Spanish coastal cities by this point, had identified pretty much every single one of the weaknesses we just mentioned and worked out a plan that was almost exactly what the Spanish were most worried he would do. But now, the supreme idiocy that was a class-based command system came into play. Drake had the knowledge, the track record of victory, the plan, and the fleet. Additionally, the one bit of the Corunna operation Drake had actually been in charge of had been the only bit that had actually worked. Norris's ground operations, obviously, had ultimately failed. But in the end, Drake was only in command of the fleet. He was, after all, a farmer's son. Okay, he had been knighted by Queen Elizabeth I, but that put him on the lowest rung of nobility. Sir John Norris, a born and bred noble, was far higher up the ranks of nobility, and he ultimately was supposed to be in command of the ground operations. And he favoured landing at Peniche, 45 to 50 miles north-northwest of Lisbon, along with Dom Antonio, where they would supposedly raise the locals to rebellion and march across the country, presumably gathering more support, before committing to a conventional siege assault on Lisbon. Because, of course, that tactic had worked out so well against the much smaller and less well-defended Corunna. Drake pointed out numerous issues. The army lacked field transport, it still had no siege guns, it also had no field artillery, it had no real extensive supplies beyond that which was on the fleet, they had almost no cavalry, and if they went via their planned route, within hours they'd be beyond the reach of the fleet to support them with naval gunfire. Drake, instead, just wanted to put the soldiers ashore in Lisbon itself. True, this was a slightly more risky approach, but if something went wrong, Everyone would be on the fleet until pretty much the last moment, so if it looked like it was all going pear-shaped, they could just turn around and leave. Accounts from the English fleet talk of a full-on screaming match between Drake and Norris, but ultimately Norris pulled rank and demanded that his approach be taken, and so a golden opportunity to completely upend the path of world history was wasted on the vainglory and arrogance of an aristocrat whose own track record against anyone who could actually fight back was mixed at best. Along with the Earl of Essex, Norris led the English troops ashore. Drake could do what he liked with his ships, they thought, but the nobles, of course, would lead on land. Of course, whilst Drake was then asked to support their attack on Lisbon, one can only imagine the string of sailors' invective he must have directed at them from a distance that effectively boiled down to, with what exactly? Since now he had only his sailors to exploit any gaps in Lisbon's defences and a handful of troops to fight off with the occasional boarding action. And you tended to need most of the men he had to actually sail the ships. The sum total of mariners aboard, in any case scattered across the entire fleet, was only a little over 4,000, and that was if you included every man, boy, officer and servant, most of whom, as we said, could not be spared from their vessels. Meanwhile, Norris and Essex were merrily wandering the Portuguese countryside with more than 12,000 armed and armoured soldiers. There now followed something of a farce of a landing, where Essex managed to crash his barges into the one part of the beach that was so rocky and so wave-swept that even the Spanish hadn't bothered to fortify it. After drowning dozens of his own men, Essex did at least manage to drive off the Spanish who were defending the beaches, who were understandably caught out of position by this unexpected line of assault. And ultimately, the English had at least now twice managed to do what the Spanish Armada couldn't, and land men on enemy soil. The Portuguese response to the arrival of this big army was a little bit muted. In the time since he'd left, Dom Antonio's star had fallen considerably with the general populace, and no great number rallied to him. But at the same time, the sheer size of the English fleet and the sudden appearance of this rather considerable army, which was sweeping aside several smaller Spanish formations as it forged ahead, meant that most of the Portuguese locals didn't feel especially inclined to fight and die for the Spanish either. The upper echelons of Portuguese society generally held to the Spanish cause, but the general apathy of the populace caused the Spanish to distrust everyone who wasn't Spanish, and thus they froze out a lot of the Portuguese upper echelons from their defence plans, which somewhat limited their resources. Drake, meanwhile, sailed his fleet to just outside the entrance to Lisbon harbour, and waited, sending out scouting vessels to see if there were any ships worth capturing in the area, or enemy fleets in the area that he needed to keep an eye out for to fight. Meanwhile, on land, small parties of fast Spanish cavalry harassed the English army as it advanced, then continued to harass them once they dug in near Lisbon. The bulk of the Spanish forces, though, had holed up in the city, reasoning that they could be resupplied by barges that came down the Tagus River, whilst they had ensured in turn that there was precious little food or other supplies around outside the city, and they knew that English troops didn't deal too well with the Iberian Peninsula's heat. Norris and his forces thus approached Lisbon's walls and tried to figure out how they could get inside without a siege train, since it was becoming more and more apparent that the general populace really wasn't rising up in rebellion to support them. By the 4th of June, it was clear that there was nothing they could do other than just continue to lose men, as all their attempts to sneak into the city had come to nothing. And so they began a retreat towards Drake's ships, coming under Spanish attack as they left, which only stopped once they reached the town of Cascais, where the guns of the fleet could protect them. Having lost hundreds of men and abandoned their assault, Essex tried to salvage the situation by challenging the Spanish to come out and fight on the open field of battle. After the Spanish had had quite a good laugh at that, they allowed the messenger to go back to Essex empty-handed. Drake, meanwhile, was steadily capturing ships full of food and dozens of merchant ships heading for Lisbon, completely unaware of the rather comical stalemate ashore. Despite defections and other losses having reduced his fleet to around 150, these captures put the fleet strength back up to around 210. By the 18th of June, it was clear that the entire thing had been a dismal failure, and so the surviving English troops were forced to re-embark, with the fleet sailing on the 18th of June. Trying to salvage something from the situation, Drake decided they might as well head for the Azores, but the wind was against him at first, simply pushing him generally south. In the light but persistent winds, the fleet became scattered, and a small force of Spanish galleys managed to pick off some of the smaller ships which had become separated to the rear of the formation, although the eventual arrival of some of the English larger ships drove the galleys off. Although, again, accounts of exactly how this went down conflict, with one or two surviving English accounts claiming that 2 or 3 small ships were lost, whereas half a dozen different Spanish accounts claim multiple engagements with between 4 and 7 ships destroyed in each engagement. In any event, a turn of the wind allowed the fleet to reassemble, and Drake headed back for Peniche to pick up the garrison they'd left there, only to find that they'd been overrun in the absence of any land or naval support. Drake then decided to head out toward the Azores again, but was once again driven off by the wind, now fetching up in Vigo, just across the northern Portuguese border in Spanish territory proper. This was raided to resupply the fleet, but it quickly turned into an outright sacking, complicated by attacks from Spanish troops who'd withdrawn outside the town when they saw the size of the English forces that were incoming, and then attacked in various raids whilst the English troops were occupied with looting and burning the town. Norris had committed far more deeply to this endeavour, taking ships further upriver, and seeing a storm brewing, Drake seems to have gotten so fed up of the whole affair he just left, which left Norris with a few dozen ships to try and follow when he could. This operation cost another half-dozen vessels between various ships which went aground and the odd straggler being picked off by Spanish ships which were tailing the English fleet. As the last ships flying English banners disappeared over the northern horizon on the 5th of July, sickness was now beginning to spread through the fleet. The fleet took about 5 days to make it back to English ports, but returned in various small groups scattered by the aforementioned brewing storm, and the sickness had spread so virulently and so quickly that many of them arrived with only just enough men aboard who were well enough to work the sails. All told, 14 ships had been sunk or captured directly by Spanish forces, and roughly as many again, or possibly slightly more, were lost to various environmental hazards, such as rocks on the coast or the storm that beset them on the way back. The bulk of the Spanish fleet, meanwhile, lay untroubled at Santander. Lisbon remained firmly in Spanish hands, and whatever minimal cachet Dom Antonio might have had in Portugal was now well and truly spent. The winds had prevented the fleet sailing to the Azores, and thus no Spanish treasure fleet had been seized. Exactly how many men died on the expedition is unknown, as estimates vary hugely, as do period accounts, but it was something a fair bit north of 2/3 of everybody who'd set out, with most of the casualties being amongst the soldiers, but not a few sailors going down as well. As a financial exercise, the fleet returned with 150 captured cannon and £30,000 in loot, but this was a total value of only just over half the original investment, which meant everybody who'd put money in would make a roughly 40% loss on every pound they'd invested, and that was assuming that all the cannon could be sold. Some of the losses were made up simply by refusing to pay many of those who'd survived the expedition. With the losses to disease after the Spanish Armada, and the still further losses after this English Armada, the brief window for Tudor England to take control of the sea had closed. Philip II was able to rebuild his fleet over the remainder of 1589, and Spanish fleets would once again prowl the ocean from 1590 onwards, leading to an escalation of the conflict that continued to drain money from both sides. The English coffers were practically empty at this point and relied on a mixture of taxes, loans, and the occasional seized treasure ship windfall to stay afloat, while Spain, whilst still fighting and still looting South America, was now engaged in over a decade of struggle on multiple fronts, and just ask Londo Mollari about the prospects of that particular enterprise. In the end, it actually took the deaths of both Philip II and Elizabeth I for peace to be reached between their successors, the Treaty of London in 1604 essentially putting things back the way they'd been before hostilities had broken out, with the sole additional caveat that Spain forswore further efforts to try and get rid of Protestant English monarchs and restore the country to Catholicism, in exchange for the English withdrawing their official support for the Dutch rebels. This latter clause was designed to try and let Spain end the Dutch revolt once and for all. But as it turned out, most of the English privateers just decided to hoist Dutch flags, and the Dutch simply recruited English troops directly into their army, and so 3 years after the peace treaty, Spain was bankrupt again, having already defaulted on its debts in 1596, and the Netherlands was thus formally recognised by its former masters for the first time. As mentioned in the previous videos on the Spanish Armada, there were 3 other Spanish Armada expeditions against England in the intervening time, but they also all met with failure, also all thanks to the wind, hence my previous assertion that maybe, Armada coin claims aside, God really did have a problem with armadas in the late 16th century. All told then, the armadas and counter-armadas ultimately proved to be exceptionally costly ways of throwing thousands of men's lives, dozens of ships, and entire GDP's worth of money into the merciless cold embrace of the sea, with about the only good thing, if you can count it as such, coming out of the entire fiasco, being that the ships that emerged in the early 1600s were somewhat better at fighting each other than the ones that had gone in the 1580s.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.